My name is Diana Mercer. I'm 30 years old, and I live in a quiet suburb just outside Seattle, where nothing ever seems to happen until the day everything did. I pressed the brakes and nothing happened. The car kept moving, faster than it should have, the road slick from the rain, my hands tightening around the wheel as I pressed again, harder this time, still nothing. My heart dropped. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a malfunction. I could feel it. I tried to steer, tried to slow it down, but the car didn't respond the way it should. It was like I had already lost control before I even realized it. Then everything spiraled. The sound of impact. Glass breaking. A force so violent it erased everything else. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed. My body barely felt like mine anymore. I had gone through 5 surgeries just to stay alive. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. It was what the police told me next. This wasn't random. Something had been done to my car, deliberately. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just destroy what was left of my life. It showed me that the danger had never been outside. Before I tell you what really happened, tell me, what time is it where you are, and what city are you watching from? I want to know how far this story has reached. And if you haven't already, take a second to subscribe and leave a comment below. Now, let me take you back to where it all really began. Long before any of this happened, Diana Mercer had already learned what it felt like to not belong in her own family. Growing up in a quiet neighborhood outside Seattle, she was always the one standing slightly to the side, never quite included, never quite enough. Her mother rarely raised her voice, but the silence spoke louder than anything else, and her older brother never needed to try very hard to remind her where she stood. Everything seemed to come easier to him: attention, approval, opportunities, while Diana was left to figure things out on her own. It wasn't one moment that pushed her away. It was years of small things adding up. The way decisions were made without her, the way her efforts were overlooked, the way her presence felt optional. By the time she reached her mid-20s, she stopped trying to fix something that had never really been whole. She left, quietly, without a scene, without asking anyone to stop her. And for 5 years she built a life that had nothing to do with where she came from. She found stability, created her own routine, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to compete for a place that should have already been hers. During those years, there were no calls from home that lasted more than a few minutes, no visits that felt genuine, and eventually, there were no attempts at all. It was as if her absence made things simpler for everyone else, and over time, she accepted that. Everything shifted when her father passed away. That was the only reason she returned. The house felt smaller than she remembered, not because of its size, but because of what filled it. Conversations were short, polite on the surface, but strained underneath, and it didn't take long for her to notice that nothing had really changed. The same dynamics were still there, only quieter, more controlled, as if everyone had learned how to hide them better. Discussions about the estate began almost immediately, framed as practical decisions, but the tension underneath them was impossible to ignore. She could see it in the way her brother spoke, carefully choosing words that sounded reasonable while steering everything in his direction, and in the way her mother avoided direct answers, as if delaying something she didn't want to face. Diana didn't argue at first. She didn't push back or demand anything, because a part of her had already expected this. Still, there were moments that stayed with her, small exchanges that didn't seem important on their own but felt different when placed together. A glance that lasted a second too long, a conversation that stopped when she entered the room, a tone that shifted when money was mentioned. None of it was obvious, nothing that could be pointed at and called proof, but it created a feeling she couldn't ignore. It was the same feeling she had known growing up, the quiet understanding that decisions were being made around her, not with her, and that whatever was coming next, she wasn't meant to see it until it was already done. The sound of twisted metal scraping across wet pavement was the last thing Diana Mercer's body seemed to remember clearly. but what followed came back in fragments that never fully connected. There was a moment where everything slowed down just enough for her to realize she wasn't going to regain control, the steering wheel resisting her hands in a way that didn't make sense. The car continuing forward as if something had already been decided long before she turned the key that morning. The impact didn't feel like a single event. It came in layers, one force pushing into another until the world around her dissolved into noise and pressure that her mind refused to hold on to. When she opened her eyes again, the environment had completely changed. The air felt different, sterile, controlled, filled with the quiet rhythm of machines doing what her body could not manage on its own. Movement was difficult, not because she didn't want to move, but because her body didn't respond the way she expected it to. It took time before she understood where she was, longer before she understood how serious it had been. The injuries were not minor, and the recovery ahead of her was going to demand more than patience. The first person she clearly recognized was her husband. Caleb Turner was sitting beside the bed, not speaking at first, just watching her closely as if he needed to confirm that she was really awake. There was no hesitation in the way he reached for her hand, and no distance in the way he stayed there, grounded in a place that had nothing to do with comfort. It was the kind of presence that didn't need to be explained, consistent and steady, as if leaving had never been an option. Nurses moved in and out, adjusting equipment, checking monitors, but he remained in the same position, barely shifting unless someone asked him to. Other faces appeared later, less constant, more controlled. Her mother stood near the foot of the bed the first time Diana fully registered her presence, her posture straight, her expression difficult to read. Victor Mercer arrived shortly after, speaking in a calm tone that carried just enough concern to sound appropriate, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Elaine Mercer followed, staying slightly behind him, observing more than participating, her attention moving between Diana and the rest of the room as if measuring something rather than reacting to it. What stood out wasn't what they said, it was how they behaved when they thought no one was paying attention. There were brief exchanges that stopped the moment Diana looked in their direction, subtle shifts in tone that didn't match the situation, and a certain distance that felt intentional rather than accidental. At one point, her mother glanced toward Caleb in a way that lingered longer than it should have, not openly hostile, but not neutral either. As if forming a conclusion, she wasn't ready to speak out loud. Time inside the hospital moved differently, not marked by hours, but by interruptions, visits, and the quiet stretches in between. Through all of it, Caleb remained consistent, while the rest of the room seemed to hold something back, something unspoken that stayed just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would finally be brought into the open. A few days later, the atmosphere inside the hospital room shifted in a way Diana Mercer could not ignore. The visit did not begin with family this time, but with a police officer who entered quietly, carrying a file that seemed heavier than its size suggested. His tone was measured, professional, and direct, without unnecessary details or hesitation. He explained that the vehicle had been examined, and what they found raised serious concerns about how the system had failed. It wasn't consistent with normal wear or sudden malfunction, and the pattern suggested that something had been altered before the car was driven that day. The words settled into the room slowly, but the reaction around her was immediate. Margaret Mercer did not appear surprised, only tense, as if she had been expecting a conclusion like this. Victor Mercer leaned forward slightly, asking controlled questions that sounded helpful on the surface, though the direction of them seemed to lead somewhere specific. Elaine Mercer remained quiet, her attention fixed on the officer, watching closely rather than reacting emotionally. Diana listened carefully, trying to process what was being said without jumping to conclusions. The officer continued, explaining that access to the vehicle would have been necessary, and that whoever was responsible would likely be someone familiar with it. That detail changed everything, not because it confirmed anything, but because of how quickly it was used. Victor was the first to speak after that, his voice steady, almost too steady, as he mentioned that Caleb Turner had been near the car recently. The statement was presented as a simple fact, something easy to verify, something that didn't sound like an accusation until it was placed in the context of everything else. Margaret did not interrupt him, and that silence carried more weight than any agreement. Within seconds, the direction of the conversation shifted completely, no longer focused on what had happened to the vehicle, but on who had been around it. Diana felt the change immediately. The way attention moved across the room and settled in one place. Caleb stood near the window, not stepping forward, not interrupting, allowing the officer to finish speaking before saying anything at all. When he did respond, his voice was calm, controlled, without defensiveness, simply stating that he had done nothing that would have caused harm. It was not a long explanation, just enough to be clear, but the reaction it received was colder than expected. The officer did not argue, but he did not dismiss the possibility either. He asked a few more questions, noting responses, observing reactions, and then made a decision that shifted the entire situation into something far more serious. Caleb was asked to come with him for further questioning, not as a formal charge, but not casually either. The tone made it clear that this was no longer just a conversation. Diana tried to sit up, her body resisting the movement, but she didn't stop. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if everything inside it was closing in at once. She spoke, insisting that this was wrong, that the conclusion being drawn did not match what she knew, but her words did not carry the same weight as the narrative that had already begun forming around her. The space between what she believed and what everyone else seemed ready to accept widened quickly, leaving her in a position where certainty no longer mattered. Caleb looked at her before leaving, not searching for answers, not asking for anything, just holding that moment steady for as long as it lasted. Then he followed the officer out, the door closing behind them with a finality that changed the room in a way nothing else had so far. As the days passed, Diana Mercer began to focus on something no one else seemed interested in questioning. The conversations around her had already settled into a direction she did not accept, and instead of arguing against it, she started looking at what had been left out. There was a point before everything happened, a window of time that hadn't been examined closely enough, and that was where her attention stayed. She asked for small details first, things that didn't sound important on their own. When the car had last been serviced, where it had been parked, who had access to it without needing permission. The answers were inconsistent, not in a way that immediately raised concern, but enough to create gaps that didn't align cleanly. One detail led her to a name she hadn't considered before. Someone who had worked on the vehicle shortly before the incident. Noah Briggs was not part of her family, not connected to any of the tension surrounding her, which made him different from everyone else she had spoken to so far. Reaching him took effort, but once she did, the conversation changed the direction of everything. Noah didn't speak in assumptions or general impressions. He was precise, explaining what he had checked, what he had adjusted, and what he had not touched. According to him, the car had been in stable condition when it left his garage, nothing that would have led to the kind of failure being described. More importantly, he mentioned something that hadn't been brought up before, a sign that the system had been interfered with after his inspection, not before it. The way he explained it made it clear that whatever had been done required knowledge, not guesswork, and that it hadn't been random. That detail changed the structure of what Diana had been told. If the vehicle had been fine after leaving the garage, then the focus shifted to what happened afterward, where it had been, and who had been near it during that time. She began retracing that period carefully, not relying on what others said, but on what she could confirm herself. The car had been parked at her mother's house more than once during those days, left there for hours at a time while she handled things inside, never thinking it required attention. When she revisited those moments, they no longer felt ordinary. There were instances she had dismissed before, brief absences, small movements that didn't seem worth remembering at the time. Now they stood out differently, Not as clear answers, but as pieces that didn't fit where they were supposed to. She didn't confront anyone yet, didn't ask direct questions, because the pattern was still forming, and speaking too early would only give others time to adjust. Instead, she continued quietly, connecting details that had been scattered across conversations, observing reactions more carefully, and noticing how certain topics were avoided rather than addressed. The more she focused on that specific window of time, the clearer one thing became. Whatever had been done to the car had not happened by chance, and it had not happened far away. It had taken place within a space that should have been familiar, handled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly when to do it. Late that night, Margaret Mercer entered the room without turning on the lights. The hallway glow followed her just enough to outline her figure before the door closed quietly behind her, leaving the space dim and still. She didn't speak right away, and that silence carried a weight Diana Mercer hadn't felt from her before. It wasn't distance this time, and it wasn't control, it was hesitation, the kind that comes when something has been held back for too long. Margaret moved closer, stopping beside the bed but not sitting down, her hands held together as if she needed something to steady them. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, not because she was trying to hide it, but because she wasn't sure how to begin. She admitted that there had been things she noticed earlier, moments she had dismissed at first, conversations she had overheard but chose not to confront directly. At the time, she convinced herself that it was nothing serious, that she might have misunderstood, that bringing it up would only create unnecessary conflict. What she described was not a single event, but a pattern. Late discussions that stopped when she entered the room, exchanges that didn't match the situation, and a shift in tone whenever certain topics were mentioned. She explained that she had tried to ignore it, to believe that whatever she thought she heard couldn't be what it sounded like, because accepting it would mean facing something she wasn't ready to accept. Then she reached into her bag and took out her phone, holding it for a moment before unlocking it. The screen lit up her face just enough to show how much this had been weighing on her. She didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, she played the recording herself, letting the sound fill the room in a way that made it impossible to interrupt or reinterpret. The voices were clear. Victor Mercer spoke first, his tone calm, calculated, discussing timing as if it were just another detail to arrange. Elaine Mercer responded without hesitation, aligning with him, refining what needed to be done, speaking in a way that removed any doubt about intent. There was no confusion in their words, no room for misunderstanding, only a direct acknowledgement of what they were planning and why it mattered. The reasoning was stated plainly, tied to control over what had been left behind, framed as something that needed to be secured rather than shared. Margaret stopped the recording before it ended, her hand lowering slowly as the silence returned. She didn't try to explain it away or soften what had been heard. Instead, she admitted that she had known for longer than she should have, that fear and denial had kept her from acting sooner. She said she had wanted to believe she was wrong, that she had waited for something to disprove it, but nothing ever did. Diana didn't respond immediately. The information settled differently than anything before it, not because it was unclear, but because it confirmed what had been forming without a name. Every detail she had been holding onto found its place at once, not creating something new, but revealing what had already been there. Margaret finally placed the phone within reach, her voice steadier now, though it carried a different kind of weight. She said they couldn't keep this inside the room, that it had to be taken further, that what had been done could not remain hidden behind silence any longer. For the first time, her words were not uncertain or delayed, they were direct, leaving no space for hesitation. The following days unfolded with a speed and clarity that left no room for denial. Once the recording was handed over, the investigation shifted direction immediately, no longer circling around assumptions, but moving towards specific actions. Evidence was reviewed, timelines were reconstructed, and the pieces that had once seemed disconnected were placed together in a way that made the situation impossible to ignore. Victor Mercer was taken into custody first, his composure from earlier replaced by a controlled silence that no longer carried the same confidence. Elaine Mercer followed, her involvement no longer something that could be dismissed or explained away. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just a series of decisions carried out with the kind of finality that does not allow anything to be taken back. At the same time, Caleb Turner was released. The shift in how he was treated was immediate, but it did not undo what had already happened. He returned not as someone restored to where he had been, but as someone who had been forced through something he should never have faced in the first place. When he walked back into the room, there was no need for explanations between him and Diana Mercer. The understanding was already there, steady and unchanged, but it existed alongside something else now. Something that could not be ignored or erased. Margaret Mercer remained present during those days, but her presence carried a different weight. She spoke less, not out of distance, but because there was nothing left that could be said to reverse the time she had spent choosing silence. Her actions had eventually shifted the outcome, but they did not undo the delay that allowed everything to reach the point it had. The space between her and Diana was no longer defined by misunderstanding. It was defined by something clearer, a recognition of what had been allowed to happen and how long it had been allowed to continue. Diana did not return to the house after leaving the hospital. The place no longer held anything that felt familiar, not in a way that mattered. The connections that once defined it had been reshaped into something else entirely, something she chose not to carry forward. There were no final conversations, no attempts to rebuild what had broken, because what had been revealed could not be reduced to a single mistake or explained through apology. It had been planned, supported by silence, and carried out with intention. She moved forward with what remained, not trying to restore what had been lost, but accepting that some things are not meant to be repaired once they are seen clearly. The idea of family, as she had known it growing up, no longer held the same meaning, and she did not try to force it back into place. Instead, she defined it differently, through the people who had stayed consistent when everything else shifted. Looking back, what stayed with her most was not the event itself, but what it revealed about trust and proximity. The person capable of causing the most damage is not always the one standing far away, but the one who understands exactly where to stand in order to go unnoticed. And sometimes, the hardest decision is not proving what happened, but deciding what to do once you know the truth. In the end, Diana Mercer did not see this as something that could be resolved, but as something that had to be recognized for what it was. Not every bond deserves to be preserved, and not every silence deserves forgiveness. Some lines, once crossed, are not meant to be redrawn, only left behind.